based on our data, the four most common types of youth participation in our sample. And you can see that we can describe those four types based on two dimensions. One of them is the dimension of high versus low political interest. And the second dimension is based on trust or distrust in institutions. So we can talk about, for example, people who are more critical and who are more normative, and also about those who are passive and those who are standby, which means they are prepared to do something if necessary. And my final point regards the characteristics of these four types. And you can see, for example, that those who are more critical tend to have lower European identity, for example, and also tend to be in worse economic situations. On the other hand, the difference in the level of interest or participation is given mostly by age and also by political efficacy, as I mentioned before. So this is a brief summary of what I said, and I think time is over. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you. And I just introduce Dr. Banaji with the second presentation. It's more based on qualitative data.
Super great to be here with you today, and lovely to see all of you. I know you're in your post-lunch stupor period, so I will talk loudly and emphatically and hope that I manage to get through my 15 minutes of slides, which is actually condensing reports which run into about 530 pages. So yes, and no, so you're going to get a flavor. It's a bit like being taken on a whirlwind tour. So the kinds of questions we were asking were really much broader than this, but I'm just for the sake of this presentation, I'm trying to narrow it down to look at things around creative participation. What does creative participation mean? Who does it? When do people do it? When do they find themselves in a position to do it? And what accounts for, so what individual biographical narratives of young people, so for instance, is it likely that someone who doesn't have a job gets involved in volunteering? How long can they sustain that volunteering without any money? Those kinds of questions, and how we then analyze those initiatives. We looked at things which were explicitly political action groups, networks, organizations of young people, volunteers, charities, NGOs. We looked at scouts and religious groups, youth art hubs and media organizations. We also looked at dissident groups who were acting against poverty, racism and inequality. I should say too that we, in our initial survey, looked at groups that were themselves racist and were fighting for a public sphere which was exclusive, which excluded migrants. It was interesting that several of those organizations were also very anti-European. Local youth clubs and sport networks were very popular. Youth-run spaces where people had taken over an area and devoted it to a particular kind of work. Youth associations, student networks, and student unions were also in our initial survey. So just to give you a sense of how we started cataloging these, and this was over 240 organizations across the 8 countries. We had spreadsheets which don't look very pretty, but actually they contain enormous amounts of information about these different organizations, some of which, quite rightly, is not public information because it's quite personal to the organizations in some way. So we had to gather that maybe by phoning the organizations or speaking to a member of the organizations. The second part was much more in-depth and detailed, where we analyzed the kinds of leaflets and documents, the online materials, but we also observed and spent, some of us spent a year, some spent 6 months with organizations, going back and forth with them, observing, helping out, and getting a sense of what they do. We catalogued more than 50 practices which the organizations said they engage in on a daily basis, sometimes on a weekly basis. So starting with really banal and perhaps even boring things like meetings and public meetings and speeches and petitions and polls. But there were also quite exciting things like performance poetry in the middle of the city centre square, sit-ins, taking unoccupied buildings and putting graffiti on the walls and making them into beautiful spaces, donating pianos to schools. So there was this one wonderful organization in the, I think it was in the initial survey, so we didn't actually do any work observing them, but they would take pianos to schools who didn't have musical instruments so that those schools could then play. You could make the argument that the welfare state should be doing that and that individuals shouldn't have to donate musical instruments, but we live in the here and now where there's less and less provision of those kinds of things in schools across the European Union. So, types of creative practices, if we analyze them, can be linked to the politics and the context of these organizations in very particular ways. So, you might have an organization built around a surprising theme or topic. It's not explicitly political necessarily. You might have a feature of creativity in the way in which the people in the organization relate to each other, but the outcome is pretty boring and mundane. Or you could have an organizational structure which is unusual and creative in how it relates to the public, so that these practices can be shared across initiatives. So the way I analyze these, I'm going to give you a very quick tour of the organizations that we spent time working with, and then I'm going to talk about some specific practices. So the Swedish organization, Awesome People, which our Swedish researchers spent quite a significant amount of time researching, is run by older young people and adults, so it isn't specifically adolescents. But it's developed a very particular method called Pay It Forward, in which one person's dream is fulfilled by the organization. Let's say this dream is something small, like being able to run a marathon, or it might be something quite major, like going to university when you've never been to university before. And the idea is then that the person whose dream is fulfilled goes on and fulfills the dream of someone else. So you automatically, by being helped, you join the organization. It has a social pay-forward aspect. This organization is explicitly not political. It's not about changing the political system so that everyone's dreams can be fulfilled. It tries to do it through an individual pay-it-forward mentality. In Germany, we looked at two contrasting types of organizations, Arbeiterkind and Greenpeace Jugend, both of which consisted of young people who were very egalitarian in the way they related to each other. And these organizations, one of them aimed at environmental change and sustainability and preventing climate change. The other one aimed at getting working class youth into university. Both of them did have issues in the way in which creativity could be incorporated. So for instance, in Greenpeace Jugend, they were prevented from doing so-called illegal activities because they were under 18. Whereas Greenpeace, the adult group, could do pretty much anything they wanted, perhaps because they're over 18. So you might want to think about that issue of sort of illegality and how it affects youth activism. In Estonia, I think we have a representative of DD Academia here today. There's a spectrum of young people in this organization who might come into the organization very passive, but after going to long training courses, discussions, meetings, and a whole program, they have a different take on what democratic values in the public sphere mean, and their understanding of involvement and engagement changes significantly over the time they're involved with this organization. These people put in enormous amounts of work, so that the type of intensity of putting in work is something which allows creativity to flourish. In the Greek organization, which is an LGBTQ space for young people, there's a lot of interesting things going on, but the one I want to highlight is the issue of counseling around mental health issues, because we found in the sphere of youth activism that there was an enormous lack of awareness of how the pressures that young people put on themselves to volunteer, in addition to going to school, in addition to going to university, might adversely affect people's health, plus the situations that they're coming out of, perhaps unemployment, perhaps family situations, have already affected people's mental health and perhaps sometimes their physical health. So this was an interesting organization which has a counselor attached to it in some way. An environmental group in Portugal do all kinds of interesting things around activism, but also educate the public, not just young people, about issues to do with climate change and sustainability. And this very tiny team of people do so many awareness-raising activities that you can see easily how the pressure on them as a small group is going to be too much after a while. So I'm going to talk a bit about that. So the kinds of activities they engage in, creating signs and banners and experiments. They might put up an experiment in the middle of a public park or space so the children can come and see what they're doing. Or create something and take it to an exhibition or a demonstration. In the UK, and here too, we have representatives from Momentum here. We looked at two quite different organizations aimed towards getting young people involved in electoral and public politics. My Life, My Say is very much an organization which was started by an individual, and so it focuses on trying to draw in people from ethnic minority communities to vote, to make sure that they understand the political process, that they relate to politicians. Momentum is a cross-generational, not just a young people's organization, but it came into being around the time of the Labour left-wing leader Jeremy Corbyn's election as an alternative leader. So these kinds of groups, and I'll just give you a minute to have a look at this slide there. These kinds of groups exemplify the different ways of relating to the public sphere. 5 minutes, that's fine. So one of the things that we observed in the Momentum group was electoral doorstep training. I don't know how many of you have ever opened the door and found someone there asking you whether you'd vote for a candidate. Can I have a show of hands if you have? Well, then these people would be the people who were standing on your doorstep and saying to you, are you going to vote? Are you going to vote for this person? But the ways in which they were training people to do it was so engaging that it was very likely that they would have a much greater success rate, and they did come the last general election. You're going to hear from these, You're going to hear from these groups tomorrow, so I won't speak too much about Radio Imaginaria, but we didn't look at enough organizations which do alternative media. And what we liked very much about this was that this was one of the only organizations which is run almost entirely by younger adolescents. They make decisions, they run the organization in a very egalitarian, almost family-like way, and the kinds of things they do are very, very innovative. So for instance, one of the things related to the European Union that they do was this program where they actually were invited by the Minister for Labour, and they had a debate. And the debate was translated in online chat, and the high school students asked critical and I think quite intelligent and interesting questions, which were then relayed for the general public, not just for young people. In the Czech Republic, I'm going to talk a bit about the next two slides. The Czech Republic has so many exciting and interesting cases that I want to show that the slides that we saw in the previous presentation, where it showed a very low level of participation in the Czech Republic, actually are not representative of the levels of creativity you might find amongst the population. So here were the two organizations, but some of the things that they did were just really articulate and beautiful in how they oriented us towards thinking about creativity and political creativity. So this one, which is so simple, is around food waste, and it's very satirical. It puts up huge posters of misshapen vegetables, and I like this because it picks up on the theme that we talked about bananas in the European Union earlier on. So I'll just give you a chance to have a look at these misshapen vegetables, which draw people into a debate about why certain types of food are not acceptable in particular societies. A second example, again from the Czech Republic, is the bringing in of homeless people as tour guides around the city. And this idea was developed in a hugely respectful way, the idea that the homeless person knows the city like the back of their hand, and that these people are then becoming extremely civic members through their showing of the places where they live as a tour guide. So, I'm going to come to my conclusions now. Creativity isn't necessarily a social good. It can be a process, it can be fun, it can be intimacy, or a new kind of politics, a different way of relating to each other. I have a quote here, I think, from Momentum, and another one from Radio Imaginaria, where they talk about old politics being so deadly boring that just injecting some fun into the process is the creativity. New media is not the only way of people being creative. And this is really important because more and more organizations we work with seem to think that the only way to be creative is to have an exciting Instagram feed. And this is something which does come from business, and it's really problematic. Creative practices can certainly be risky and illegal. They can push boundaries. In fact, many of the rights that people in this room take for granted today, that people take for granted in their everyday lives, were rights that some people at some point fought for, and that used to be illegal. And I mean it, from voting sense of what the law is that this activity is protesting. Creative activism is wonderful, it's an honor to do it, but it's also a huge burden, and we need to think before we demand that people volunteer their time to do this kind of creative activism. We saw high levels of exhaustion in almost every one of the organizations that we worked with, and we saw the same people being called on to contribute, to give ideas, and sometimes you were scared to put your hand up and say, I'll do this, or this is exciting, because you knew you'd be alone doing that thing. And that kind of political loneliness where somebody's carrying out a very difficult task on their own and then would be blamed if it didn't go well is also something we need to consider as adults. So there are dozens of exciting creative practices that young people do across the European Union, but we as adults and as people involved in formal politics should not instrumentalize youth voice and take it from these organizations and say, here you go, we've given them the money or the tools to do this. I think that's deeply problematic. Democratic processes take a lot of time, and we need to be able to enable that time. And whether that means funding autonomous youth organizations and not asking for them to do what we ask them to do, allowing them to be themselves and funding them, or whether it means some other form of debate, is a very important question. Finally, the far right across Europe, the populist far right, is growing. They're learning about using Instagram too. They do very exciting alternative media which draw people in, including young people. So we need to be aware that anything we say in these presentations here, we cannot assume that it's always going to be used in civic, democratic, and socially acceptable ways. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Now I please, the third presentation is Floresta.
Okay, thank you very much. So the partners came back to the conference, and we as International Youth Partner are proud to be here, and just want to thank the coordinator of the project, Elia, and Professor, all the university, all the colleagues, Cinzia, for the great job that we did together in the dissemination team, all the teams, researcher teams. I'm doing it now because I don't want to forget at the end of my speech. So, our role, the role of Forum Nazionale Giovani, as I said before, the President is here and really proud of that, was to help all the consortium to disseminate somehow the project to several stakeholders. Stakeholders that come from youth organizations, stakeholders that come from, of course, other political parties, stakeholders that come from, in general, decision makers. And through this dissemination activity, we had two important commitments. The first was to produce the final video of the project that we are going to see, and the second was to do a toolkit for youth organizations that I'm presenting, and not only that I'm presenting now. So the toolkit is coming from what the Professor Banaji said before, so the huge amount of work that the coordinator, together with the other research team of research, done on the ethnography about youth organizations on WP8. So the toolkit was, you can find the toolkit in your bag, probably you already seen it, was prepared to the needs of youth organizations and the youth workers in general. And I think that can be called a container of all of these stories of participation in a way that can be simple, in a way that can be readable for people. So this is a toolkit that allows all European, probably for us, youth organization and youth workers or stakeholders also to understand which are the explore of the results that we want to give also in these 2 days during the conference, in a long-term perspective. Before Professor Banaji already said which were the meanings of organizational selection criteria, so I don't want to repeat myself. But for sure, one of, for us, very important element that we find in order to select also those information that we are going to see that are present in the toolkit was the replicability and sustainability over the time of the initiatives promoted from the organizations. So the organizations from the countries that, of course, belong to the partner countries, many forms of participation. Of course, you can find inside the toolkit some information so that we can see, of course, that not all active citizens can be done by voting or belonging to a political party. But of course, education and training are also tools for active citizenship, as well as sharing the personal experience, as some organizations did, and we present this in the toolkit. So, which is the structure of the toolkit? The first, we divided the toolkit in categories and subcategories. All categories belong to the work packages that so far, at the moment we the toolkit were already done. So involving people in policy dialogue, active European citizenship for all, raising its voice within all the new media, formal and non-formal educational context. The contents and the structure is belonging to the genesis of the organizations first. We describe the genesis of the organization, the aims and objectives of those organizations, main practices and implementation, futures and challenges, and some insights. I know that in the room are some of those organizations. Really, thank you was already told you was really inspiring reading about your history and your initiatives. Each chapter ends with specific practical recommendations. Those recommendations underlie the steps required, of course, to implement specific practices of active participation among young people. Those recommendations, of course, are produced by the academic world in the one sense, and the other sense from the International Youth Panel, that I thank you for all the help that you give and the force that you give to the project, with a position paper. In general, those recommendations give a general statement that can be the reinforcement of young people participation in youth organizations is certainly the basis of limiting disengagement and apathy. Other general statements say that ensuring a good quality of work and the sustainability of activities becomes fundamental to support the long-term active citizenship of young people. These two, according to me, are in general the statement that we can get from all those recommendations. And then the recommendations, you can see that they can be divided to political decision makers or to youth organizations, youth workers, animators that are inside the organization as well. I select some of those organizations. Of course, you can find all the recommendations inside the toolkit. For sure, I don't want to say which is the best or the most important, but probably inside the toolkit you can find recommendations that are very concrete or recommendations that are really wide. But in general, all those recommendations we think are going to the direction on which we suppose the European institution and the European Commission or all the public body at the national and the regional level should do. Youth organizations, of course, were a part of those recommendations, say before, because sometimes I become from youth organizations, sometimes we are not so aware about what we should do. We only think about what other people or other organizations should do. But this project we even gave the opportunity also to youth organizations to understand some tips or advice that experts from the academic world, but not only, can give to them. So the toolkit, why, and so I say that can be seen in a long-term perspective, can allow those organizations to grow together with institutions. This is the aim of the toolkit, and I think this was the aim also of in general of the project. So please get a copy, share it, download it, and of course enjoy the conference.
So, we just will start with discussion, and let me invite you, our discussant for this meeting on podium, Eva Majewski, and Joe King, and Antia Roli, and Fabienne Mete. And also, I ask speakers to take place to discuss. Yeah, please speakers.
Do you need us there now? Do you need us there now?
Yeah, we will. Yeah. So, the topic is participation and engagement. We have a possibility to hear some interesting results, and now I would like also to start some discussion. I prepare some questions for our discussants. We have limited time, of course, so if you will present some ideas.